is no international order or sovereignty when the most powerful military in the world can, without cause, go in and kidnap a president and first lady. That's the first point. And to even assume that there's a basis for discussing that shows the lack of commitment to precisely this idea of dialogue and solidarity. From the United States, we saw the president give an interview to the New York Times where he said he doesn't accept international law, where he said that he will do what he wants to do. Now that's throwing out all treaties and all agreements going back to the founding of the United Nations. And so the question is going to be, how do you bring the United States into coherence with international law? And I'll just add that President Trump, when he came into office, said he wanted to end regime change. He wanted to end permanent wars. And yet he adopted a policy which is precisely the policy of the war hawks and the neocons in the United States. So it's not just the international community that has to act. The American people have to act. The American people voted for him in part because he said he was going to end this kind of behavior. And now he's doubling down on it. So I would say that that's the starting point for the discussion. This is unacceptable under any circumstances. There's no evidence to back the charges, and this has to be reversed immediately. Many things from that question to unravel. Let me start with the Ukraine question. I don't consider what the special military operation launched by Russia against Ukraine to be similar to what Trump just did to Venezuela. Putin tried for years to get an acceptance from the Western countries that there was a legitimate security concern that Russia had with NATO moving up on its borders. No country can turn its back to having an enemy, as NATO was an enemy to Russia, to move weapons to the border and then to start killing people in the eastern part of that country. And Putin did try repeatedly. They had the Minsk Accord, and the West lied to the Russians about it. So I don't think there's an equivalence. I don't think Trump can say, well, Putin did it, so we can do it. And even if that were the case, if someone acts badly, that doesn't give you an excuse to do the same. Now, secondly, on the question of drugs, look, this is complete hypocrisy. The CIA has been the major drug trafficker in Central America for years. This is what the whole Iran-Contra affair was about. This is what the Southern Air Transport was about. This was about the funding of the Contras. This is a perfect example of changing the subject. And they even had to admit that there is no such thing as the drug gang that they say Maduro was in charge of. So what is this about? Is it really an attempt to save the American people from drug traffickers? No. You want to save Americans from drug traffickers? Go after the big international banks that launder the drug money. And that drug money is used to fund operations against the countries that are involved in the drug traffic. The idea of shooting boats out of the water is going to stop drug trafficking is absurd. Now, the bigger point here is, as I said earlier, President Trump won the election in 2024 by saying that he was going to put an end to this kind of great power claim that they had a right to go to war, that they had a right to demand that countries adhere to a rules-based order. The rules-based order, as Blinken and Biden and the Americans put it, was not the rules-based order. The rules-based order is the UN Charter and international treaties. What was being enforced under the rules-based order was an imperial policy to defend Western banks and corporate cartels. And it was an attack on the sovereignty of the nations that were being looted. So I think virtually every aspect of the explanations from Trump, from the media, from the US military is false. Now, what do I think they're really trying to do? I think this is targeting the emergence of a new multilateral system. They're trying to say that we're not going to let Russia or China build railroads or bridges or power plants in South America. The same way they're saying that they're not going to allow that in Africa. And it's a form of ultra-imperial policy, which is based on the idea that we have the power to dictate the terms. And if you don't agree with us, we have color revolutions, we have regime changes, we have sanctions we can impose, and so on. And I just want to add one other point. I was looking last night at what happened in Iran in 1953. And I bring this up because you now have a Venezuela-Iran situation as it existed in the late 40s, early 50s. In the late 40s, there was an effort to steal Venezuela's oil. And an agreement was made where the US corporations got 50% of the oil money and Venezuela got 50%. And the British said they're not going to allow that in Iran. The British insisted that 87% of the Iranian oil go to the corporations and only 13% to Iran. This led to a national uprising in Iran, which voted in a president, Mossadegh, who then was overthrown in a coup by the British and the United States after he nationalized the oil. So now we see today, Venezuela and Iran, again, they're trying for regime change in Iran. Why? Because Iran stands for this principle of multilateralism. Similarly with Venezuela. And Venezuela has defended this principle against the likes of US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has a long connection to anti-Cuban networks that are run by the CIA. So I think what we're dealing with here is the end of an American imperial idea that says we have the power and we can impose the terms on every country. And the people of Venezuela are showing remarkable courage and discipline by standing up against this. I think people in Africa can look at this and also see that this is the way you have to deal with this, because we're seeing something similar going against Nigeria, the attempt to intervene in French West Africa, and so on. We need solidarity among all sovereign nations to reject this kind of gunboat diplomacy or law of the jungle. Well, I respectfully disagree with Mr. Owusu on the Ukraine situation. I've studied this for years. I live in Germany now, and I've seen the documents. There was an effort going back to the fall of the Soviet Union by Western corporate cartels, the CIA, and the British, to figure out how to break apart Russia. And their idea was to treat Russia as a colony, as they have been treating countries of Africa for generations, for hundreds of years. The idea that Russia has raw materials, but Russia was weak because of the fall of communism, and you could now go in and impose economic policies, the so-called shock therapy doctrine, which undermined Russia's standard of living. Now, they repeatedly discussed this. The Primakov, who was the prime minister in the end of the 1990s, finally said, look, we have to form an alliance with India and China to defend our country. And at the same time, there was the move of NATO eastward to the borders of Russia, because there were people in the West who wanted to break apart Russia, who were open about this. Now, what happened? Well, in 2014, as Victoria Nuland admitted, the US had spent $5 billion to organize a color revolution in Ukraine. Now, that's where you see the evil policy of the American deep state, that they spent money to rile up the Ukrainians to turn against Russia. And the coup that took place in February was a coup, a Western especially U.S. and British coup, using neo-Nazi elements of Western Ukrainian militias to carry out the coup. Now, Putin appealed repeatedly for discussions of this, and there were discussions. In fact, let me remind you of the Minsk Accord, where the French and the Germans said they would work with Russia to end the attack on the people of the Donbass. And what did Merkel admit? What did the French president admit? They never intended to do that. They signed that agreement to buy time to arm Ukraine. So when you look at the Russian actions on Ukraine, and I agree with you, you never have a right to say, well, someone else did something wrong, so we can do it also. But I think Putin made the point repeatedly that he tried to resolve this, and he couldn't, because the West intended to loot Russia and to gain acceptability for this form of internationalism. This is what the United States has been doing. This is what happened in Iraq. It's what happened with Afghanistan. It's what happened with Libya. And you know very well, Mr. Owusu, this is what's been done to every single country in Africa, including your own country. So the Western powers assert their superior right to determine what the rules-based order is. And I think what we saw with the special military operation in Ukraine was an attempt to call attention to this unfair, unjust policy. Now, had Putin wanted to, he could have destroyed Ukraine, but he didn't. Now, here's where I see the difference with the United States going into Venezuela. I don't trust people like Hegseth, who now calls himself the Secretary of War. I don't trust Marco Rubio. Rubio is a vindictive, evil character who is working with CIA networks that were involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. And he sees himself as a revolutionary, not just targeting Venezuela, but targeting Venezuela to get Cuba and to get Mexico, and possibly what they're doing to Argentina with the government there, and what they'd like to do again to Brazil if they could bring back Bolsonaro. So we're talking about a very nasty imperial regime in Washington, which claims the right to do this to any country that doesn't accept their so-called rules. So I think that's the big difference between the Ukraine situation and Venezuela. There's an attempt to get peace in Ukraine. Who's opposing it? The Europeans now. And the Europeans are opposing it because they want a military buildup. The Germans are talking about €1 trillion in building up an army to go to war against Russia. So I think while in general the idea of moral equivalence is right, that you don't accept unjust activities against the state, there are different circumstances, and you have to take that into consideration when you're dealing with the Russia-Ukraine situation.